they believe that the unity, the unprecedented unity that we've seen in the West is already fading a little bit. It's more fragile than people thought. They believe that the West, is already United States, Europe is concerned with a lot of other issues, and that if that goes away, if that solidarity and that unity goes away, it will be easier for them to resume this fight.
Let me ask you, first of all, about these ferocious battles which are continuing for the city of Severodonetsk. Just one city, but one key strategic point in that onslaught, really, right across the east of Ukraine. What do you make of what's going on there?
Well, there is very, very heavy fighting going on. It looked as if the Russians had taken most of Severodonetsk, and I think they still have much of it, but the Ukrainians are pushing back. And in fact, there's street fighting going on. And so one day, one street might be really controlled by the Russians and the next day by the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are fighting as hard as they can, but the Russian goal, if they take Severodonetsk, means that they would now control the whole of the Luhansk region, which is one of the two so-called republics in the Donbass region where the separatists have been supported by the Russians since 2014. And so if they control that, they would then have, as President Zelensky himself said, about control of about 20% of Ukraine's territory, whereas before the war, they controlled 15%. So it really would be a setback for the Ukrainians, and that's why they're fighting so hard to try and wrest that control from the Russians. But it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, and President Zelensky has once again appealed for more help from the West. And what do you make of these comments of his saying that stalemate is not an option for his country? He seems to be saying that he's simply not prepared to leave Russia in control of, as you've explained there, perhaps 20% of his country.
Yes, well, I mean, so many thousands of Ukrainians have died. There have been these atrocities committed against civilians. And for the Ukrainians now to sort of accept that they've lost more of their territory, then they really would have been fighting in vain, which is why they really do want to push back. Weapons are on the way, weapons from the United States, from Britain and other countries, but they haven't all got there. And they need to get there very quickly for them to be able to push the Russians back. But they're not going to come to the negotiating table anytime soon. And the Russians really don't want that either, because if the Russians do succeed in taking Severodonetsk, then they will probably continue and try and take the entire Donbass region, because there's still a lot of the Donetsk so-called People's Republic that they have to take.
Yeah, I mean, it was seen as a very significant move when the US and the UK decided to send these longer-range missile systems.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you think the danger is that they might arrive too late?
Well, that is one of the dangers, and hopefully they're arriving soon. I don't think anybody knows quite what the timetable is, but it might be too late. I mean, they really would need to get there very soon. This week, because next week might be too late.
So just to go back to what President Zelensky has been saying today, he's clearly aware that for all the setbacks, those Russian forces have made gains, haven't they, as you were saying, right along that eastern point. Do you think that Russia might at some stage be prepared to say, look, we've got where we want to in terms of control of the east of the country and that strip along the south, and to then be prepared to negotiate? Or do you think that we really are just into this long, many months more of an attritional war that's taking so many lives on both sides?
Well, I think it's more likely that we're into a very long attritional war. It's theoretically possible that if the Russians do take more territory in the Donbass, more than they have now, the whole of the Donetsk region, they might say, all right, let's sit down. Ukraine, you have to accept that you've lost essentially the entire Donbass region. The Russians are already talking about incorporating territories that they've conquered into Russia. And they might be willing at that point to sit down and to regroup. But this isn't the end of it. You could have a ceasefire. You could have less fighting or no fighting for some time. But Putin's aim is definitely to take all of Ukraine, to subjugate all of Ukraine. And so this would be a lull, but it wouldn't be an end to the war. This war is going to continue for a very long time, unless Russia were to change its war aims. And it's unlikely to do that as long as Putin's in the Kremlin.
Well, he certainly hasn't admitted to changing his war aims, but we saw those Russian troops forced to pull back from the original attempt to get to and encircle Kyiv. Do you really think that his overall goal is still to control the whole of Ukraine? Or do you think that he could perhaps try to maybe dress up some control of those eastern autonomous areas as achieving the goals that he set out to achieve when he launched this invasion?
Well, don't forget, just a couple of days ago, there were attacks against Kyiv again. So I do think it's possible that the Russians could at some point stop for the time being. But that is not the end of it. I mean, the goal remains, and they do believe that they have momentum on their side. They believe that the unity, the unprecedented unity that we've seen in the West is already fading a little bit. It's more fragile than people thought. They believe that the West, is already United States, Europe is concerned with a lot of other issues, and that if that goes away, if that solidarity and that unity goes away, it will be easier for them to resume this fight. So we should not expect that this is going to be over anytime soon.
We saw those comments from President Macron saying that Russia should not be humiliated, and he and Prime Minister Draghi of Italy have been trying once again to try to get some sort of talks, negotiations underway. Was that a sensible attempt to try to get talks of at least some sort going, or do you think that it did send out a message that the West is not as united as it was at one stage?
Well, I suppose there's nothing wrong in these leaders talking to Putin, although it doesn't seem to have gotten anywhere. Macron's probably talked to Putin more than anyone else. Chancellor Scholz joined him the other day, and as you say, the Italians and the Austrians and others have been talking to Putin. But I think it conveys the impression to Putin that there isn't total unity about this in the West. And he can sort of play with this. He can use this as a form of leverage. So I think there's nothing wrong in talking to him, but I think everyone should be clear-eyed that doesn't really mean that he's prepared to go to the negotiating table, unless Ukraine were to surrender fully.
Yeah, I mean, President Zelensky was clearly pretty annoyed at the tone that was struck by Macron and Draghi, wasn't he? I mean, he seemed to take their suggestions as putting in or as suggesting that perhaps he should be prepared to cede territory in order to get proper negotiations underway.
Well, of course, there are people both in Europe and in the United States who say this fighting has gone on for a very long time. The casualties have been enormous. The sanctions are not only affecting Russia, but they're affecting all of us. Inflation, high energy prices, and things like that. And maybe it's time for the Ukrainians to sue for peace, to realize that, this war has to stop, the suffering has to stop. There are clearly voices for that. But then there are others who say, this will just mean appeasing Russia until Russia launches another attack. And I suppose to say one shouldn't humiliate Putin is a fairly extraordinary thing to say, because if you look at the performance of the Russian military so far, that's part of it's been quite humiliating anyway. So, but I think you have these two different views, certainly in the West, about how this should continue.
What about this blockade of the southern ports, which, as you referred to there, is having an effect globally on food supplies, grain supplies, oil supplies? There have been suggestions from the Prime Minister of Lithuania and others that there should be some kind of Western attempt to break the blockade. Do you think that is realistic?
Well, there's certainly different kinds of negotiations going on. We do face a looming food catastrophe, really, particularly for the developing world. The Russians are blocking the ports. They won't let the Ukrainians export all of the grain that's just sitting there, waiting to be exported. The Russian foreign minister, I believe, is going to Turkey very soon, Mr. Lavrov. The Turks are trying to see whether they can act as a mediator to break the blockade, but the Russians would then insist that the Turks also demine the Ukrainian ports, and the Ukrainians, of course, have mined them because of what the Russians are doing. That's a possibility. There are other discussions, I think, on the United Nations level to try and do something about this. But so far, the Russians have held out, and Putin has said, if you want us to unblock this, you have to start removing the sanctions. So he's still playing very hard at the moment and not making concessions. And interestingly, the head of the African Union, who was in Sochi talking to Putin a couple of days ago, was also trying to persuade Putin to end the blockade. But Putin then blamed the West and the Ukrainians for this. So I think that the struggle really is to get the, if you like, global South to understand that the reason this is happening is because of what Russia's doing. And because many of those countries have neither criticized Russia nor sanctioned Russia and aren't willing to do so, this makes it more difficult.
And we saw that walkout by Russia's ambassador to the UN yesterday when he was accused of essentially stealing supplies. But
Yeah.
what about this suggestion that there should be some kind of military force to break that blockade?
Well, I think that might work. It can't be a NATO force for obvious reasons. But if there's some other way that there can be military intervention to break it, without then incurring, aggression, more aggression from Russia, that might be one way to do it. I think it's a difficult situation.
Yeah, because clearly there would be, whichever countries did get involved, I mean, there would be huge risks in trying to force some kind of safe corridor out of those ports to allow the supplies to flow.
Yes, I think that. I mean, there are a lot of dangers. I mean, the best thing would be to have a negotiation with the Russians where they're willing to lift the blockade, but they will surely demand something in return for that. And I don't think they're going to get sanctions relief for that.
The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has been one of the staunchest supporters of President Zelensky. Spoke to him yesterday morning before he faced a no confidence vote in his own leadership. But do you think that he is increasingly out on a limb when it comes to Western opinion? He, along with the United States, is sending these more advanced weapons systems. But clearly his approach is very different from that we've just been talking about from the French and Italian leaders, let alone the Germans and others.
Well, certainly. I mean, what you can see is, if you like, an Anglo-Saxon axis, the United States and Britain being very supportive. Of course, the Prime Minister has actually been to Ukraine, which President Biden hasn't yet, because I think his people believe the security risks were too great. He's very popular in Ukraine. I just saw something on social media that there's a special ice cream named after him now. I mean, but certainly the U.S. and Britain, and then the Baltic states and Poland. Those seems to be the countries who are most supportive of Ukraine, toughest in terms of what they're willing to do in dealing with Russia. But certainly France, Germany, Italy particularly, not even to mention Hungary, which of course is quite out of line here, but a number of European countries don't take this attitude towards Russia. They're very wary of supplying Ukraine with weapons that could somehow be used to escalate the situation. So you do see that division there, although we still have unity on sanctions and we have NATO unity on that. There are clearly differences of opinion between major European countries about what one should or shouldn't supply Ukraine.
Angela Stent, former US National Intelligence Officer for Russia and a former senior NATO advisor.